Hi, folks. We're going to start the presentation at 6:05, just to give stragglers a little bit of a chance to come in. I have put in the chat a link to the town's website with some materials, if you haven't found those already. So just sit tight and we'll get started at 6:05. Okay, I'm going to get started with this presentation. I'm Xander Gopen. I'm a senior planner with the Service Commission. Um, the Service Commission, along with myself, have been working with the town of St. Andrews since 2018. Alex Henderson is not here, but he is the planning director. And if you know me, you might know him as well. He's certainly been involved in the work up to this point, but it's just going to be me tonight um, going through the bylaw, the proposed St. Andrews zoning bylaw. So I'll give a little bit of context up front. I'll talk about the overall concept, um, talk about the general standards that apply regardless of zone, uh, with some caveats to that. I'll talk about the zones themselves. And then I think what's very useful is to talk about the current zones and the current rural plans and the current zoning bylaw, and how these new proposed zones compare to those, how they're the same, how they're different. We'll talk about next steps. And then it'll be if there's questions or comments. This is the second public consultation we've done on the zoning bylaw so far. Not a public hearing of objections, that kind of formal stage. We're still very much in the informal consultation process. That being said, council is listening. There's a couple of councilors here tonight, and we're recording this, so there can be review, and we do look at all the feedback we get. And address it with council, whether or not it ends up in the final draft. So with that, I'll move into the presentation. So just a bit of context at first. The zoning bylaw is the primary implementation tool of the municipal plan. It divides the municipality into zones with permitted land uses, dimensional and design standards, and general standards for specific land uses. So the municipal plan can be kind of general and have kind of more openly interpretable statements of policy or proposals, things that council maybe should consider. The zoning bylaw is really a regulatory document of standards that are either specific land uses or specific dimensions. It's much more of a black and white document. And this new zoning bylaw, like most new bylaws for the municipality, would cover the whole municipality. One of the reasons that council wanted to undertake this is there is a new municipality now, new geographic boundaries as of 2023. And some of the rural plans I'll talk about, they're quite old. There's been issues because of them. And even the current zoning bylaw in the former municipal boundaries, there's been some issues we found working with it since its creation in the most recent version was 2022, but it's largely unchanged since a 2018 version, which was very much based on a 2010 version. So conceptually, all of the zoning bylaw rural plan stuff is from the 2009, 2010 era. As well as having new municipal boundaries, the province has also added new planning standards for zoning bylaws and other planning documents. They are called the Statements of Public Interest. If you've heard me talk about the zoning bylaw or municipal plan before, you've heard reference to those. The province now is basically saying there's certain things that the local government bylaws must do. And there's also, we have the requirement to consult with provincial departments, get their feedback, and they will sometimes tell us this, we don't think this meets the statement of public interest as it relates to our area, agriculture, or environment, could be any of those departments. So that's something we have to keep in mind when we're drafting new bylaws now. So that is part of the how. That's one aspect of the triangulation. There's also a background study process that we started in fall, I think, of 2024. And so maybe you came to some of those consultation sessions, which were a bit more open-ended. We're kind of getting feedback on the kind of desktop aspects of the background study to make sure we're going in the right direction. And some of the early kind of policy stuff for the municipal plan came out of there, especially some of the mapping for it. And we, as well as that public consultation, there was a series of public consultations on the municipal plan. The zoning bylaw has to conform with the municipal plan. So if we made changes to the municipal plan based on that feedback, then the zoning bylaw would reflect that if it was relevant. The current bylaws that apply across the municipality in Bayside, the former local service district of Bayside, there's a rural plan from 2009, the St. Croix Corridor South Rural Plan, essentially a conservation plan, extremely limiting development, 30 meters from the edge of the high water on that side. That came into effect in 2021. And the first bylaw or planning bylaw for the whole municipality was the subdivision bylaw, which came into effect in 2023. That is not really being considered under review at this time, as it was designed for the whole municipality with the statements of public interest in mind. Council was very aware of that when they passed it. In Shamcook, it's a fairly similar situation. The Shamcook Rural Plan is from 2011. It's fairly similar to the Bayside Rural Plan with some differences, some that make sense, like Bayside has an industrial area, some that don't make a whole lot of sense. And there's other issues with it as well. And the St. Croix South Corridor Rural Plan, there's that little bit of Shamcook that touches the St. Croix estuary there. And then there's a subdivision bylaw. In the former town boundaries, there's the municipal plan from 2020. And part of this zoning bylaw process is adopting a new municipal plan, which we've council set a date for a public hearing just the other night. So that is moving ahead. You've got the zoning bylaw from 2022, although there's been a lot of tweaks to it even since 2022. There's been multiple amendments. And as I said before, that zoning bylaw conceptually really isn't that different from the one that came into effect in 2010. So it's even though there have been updates, it is unwieldy to work with for a lot of that kind of reason. It's just sort of tacked on over time, different things. And it's one of the reasons we're recommending to council that there's this kind of new concept for the whole municipality. The secondary municipal plan as well applies within the former municipal boundaries, specifically within the town plat and the historic business district. And then you've got the subdivision bylaw as well. So those are the current bylaws. This was public consultation from the background study. We did surveys asking people, what the most important things were, basically ranking qualitatively, and through that, and these aren't really ranked; they're all kind of equally important. They all feed into each other. We heard that it's very important that there's a continued delivery of high quality public services and infrastructure. There's protection and conservation of the physical environment, including protection of the Shamcook Lake drinking watershed, mitigating and adapting to the impacts of climate change, including erosion and sea level rise, developing housing that meets the needs of all residents, specifically housing that is affordable, preservation of rural way of life and rural economic development, including promotion of local agriculture, tourism that supports local residents and businesses without straining resources, maintaining the historically significant character of the St. Andrews area. So that's kind of the context. And now I'll start talking about the plan itself. So this kind of conceptual thing that I've mentioned a few times, rather than having zones for specific land uses, which is kind of an older style of zoning bylaw, really think about the intensity of the land use and the capacity of the land to deal with that. Capacity could be municipal services like potable water, sewer, storm sewers, things like that. It could be where there aren't those municipal services. It could be, having space for septic fields, wells. What is the road access like in rural areas? So thinking about zoning based on that. Z2201, that's that former municipal zone or current municipal zoning bylaw, the one that is in effect today. It's quite complicated. I'll pick on the sign section in particular. It's 13 pages long, just regulating signs, and mostly that's in the historic business district. So in this version, I think we got that down to maybe 4 pages, which is still a lot. And it still focuses on the urban core. It's not creating new sign regulations outside of there. But that's just an example of how complicated it was. Very challenging to administer as well. On the flip side, the rural plans were very general. You would have 3 or 4 zones, the main one being a rural zone, which allowed most things up to light industrial uses, which is kind of a vague thing, but the idea is that could exist next to residential uses or institutional uses, agriculture, forestry, kind of everything up to the heavy industrial. And that led to land use conflicts. They're still in effect. They still could lead to land use conflicts. And those are plans that we've been involved with for a fairly long time administering, and they definitely need to be updated. And in some ways, they need to get a little bit more complicated, not extremely complicated, but there needs to be a little bit more separation of uses there, or at least separation of intensity of uses. So I'll talk about all the individual zones. I won't go through that diagram. I did mention there's this distinction between places that have urban services, which allow for significantly more density of population and businesses, and you can just tell from the sizes of properties that you're squeezing a lot more in because you don't have to worry about separation distances for wells and septics and all that stuff. So there's a fair amount of difference in the zoning in there and some of the general standards. And that's, partly a response to public input around it's important that rural areas stay rural, and having urban standards would be counteractive to that. So trying to keep the urban standards where there are urban services. Some of these general standards, limits on light pollution, it's important everywhere, but especially in the rural parts of the municipality. One of the reasons people love living in rural areas is dark skies, being able to see the stars, not having these spotlights glaring up from the ground. So there are some general standards for making sure that larger developments don't have that type of lighting. It's all shielded, downward facing, that kind of thing. Shoreline protection. So there's a lot of coastline in this area. And if you have people just changing elevation of coastal areas significantly without conditions, it can lead to issues for neighboring properties. So this zoning bylaw is saying if there's still the ability to do shore protection work, and if you're not changing the elevation more than a meter, it's a very simple process. But if it's more than a meter, the chances for impact to your neighbors, they're much greater. So it needs to be addressed specifically. There's also general standards for agriculture, livestock, and backyard hens. And those ones kind of depend on which zone you're in. There's some zones that allow livestock, agriculture with livestock, large livestock. And there's some that limit it to basically a few backyard hens, and that would be more within your urban service boundary, which is the situation today. There's allowance for Depending on your lot size, you could have a few chickens, hens specifically. Don't think there's really been any, haven't seen any. But in the rural areas, there even in the rural areas, the importance of having enough space for those larger livestock, for the nutrient loads they will add to the carrying capacity of the land, almost like people. Um, it's a very important part of planning is dealing with waste. Um, that's in the general standards, whereas in I think it's the Shamcook rural plan, there really aren't general standards for agriculture right now. Resource uses as well as agriculture, like basically resource extraction, so gravel pits, quarries, and mines. There's basically provincial best practices that you would see across the province, and um, these allow these types of developments to happen in the right places with the right guardrails around them. Campgrounds, and all of these are a little bit more focused on rural areas, but they do technically apply across the municipality. So campgrounds is another thing in rural areas where you have that very general standard. Sometimes you could have, depending on the type of equipment, you could have tons and tons of RVs, glamping domes, things like that. And the province actually used to regulate campgrounds, and they stopped, I think, in the early 2000s. And so it's really important that municipalities, when they have the ability to regulate campgrounds, once it gets beyond a certain number of tents or cabins, or again, thinking about the carrying capacity of the land, there need to be some general standards for that. A single kind of camp, that's a different thing, but once you start having multiples, that requires a little bit more standards. Still allowable in most areas if those standards are followed. Subdivisions in low intensity zones. One of the maybe more unique things about St. Andrews is it has these very clear kind of patterns that we've tried to reflect in the zoning. And there are these more established rural residential areas. They're not exclusively residential, but like if you think about on the Bayside side, Route 127 to the water, it's more of an established residential area. And also you have along the road there, once you start getting closer to Shamcook Lake, it's more forested, more camps, and so those lower intensity zones that don't have that road access capacity, a lot of the lots are accessed by long private lanes, things like that. If there was a lot of subdivision, a lot more lots added there, part of that character would be lost. And also, it would really stress the carrying capacity of the land. So there's some limitation on subdivisions in those lower intensity zones, and I'll talk about what those are in a second. There's general standards for mini home parks and bare land condominiums or cluster developments. Essentially, those are ways of having multiple dwelling units on one piece of property versus subdividing it into multiple pieces of property. And so there's the ability to have more flexibility when there's one common owner of common areas, like an HOA or a condo board or something like that. Landscaping and drainage. This is much more important in urban areas, and these ones that are asterisked, they are only applicable in the urban service boundary, where you have typically at least an acre of lot to develop. There's enough space, there's enough carrying capacity of the land to absorb any stormwater. But when you have tighter development, it's much more important that that stormwater is managed and directed. Either you make sure it's contained within the property and filters down into aquifers, or it gets directed into the municipal storm sewer system by going out onto the road, and it doesn't go onto a neighboring property. There's also where some of the zones have a little bit more flexibility around higher density residential uses and institutional residential uses. There are standards that have been put into the bylaw for design for those specific types of uses. Things like entrances, accessing a main street with sidewalks, landscaping, common areas, amenity areas, which may be fenced off. So there's a lot of focus on okay, yes, maybe this bylaw is allowing a little bit more density in some of the lower density areas of the of within the urban service boundary. But if those developments are going to happen, they need to have really high standards for their design. That's clearly a very important thing in St. Andrews, and it's not just for um, current residents; it's for people who are going to live in these developments. Having that those standards come from regulation, make sure that developers will actually meet them and not just try and kind of do the cheapest thing possible. And not all developers do that, but it's certainly one of the reasons why we have these regulations. So this is the overall picture of the zoning map. There is, I put a link in the chat, and I believe there is a virtual zoning map that you can look at there. You can zoom in, you can search by property. One of the reasons why we're doing this process is, there's hundreds, if not thousands of properties, and we use the best tools we have to make sure we're getting things right. And we do a pretty good job, but we know there's going to be things that we miss. So it's really important if you see something with your property and you think, oh, this is going, this doesn't make sense to me. Why would it be this way? It's really important that you reach out, and either there's a reason for it, or it's something that could be changed at this stage very, very easily. Versus once a bylaw comes into effect, you can make changes, but it has to go through a council process. It's a little bit more complicated. So nothing now is locked in. We can make changes very easily, and we would definitely want to if there was not an intentional decision to do something here. So I'm gonna go in order of capacity, or intensity, really intensity, not capacity. I'm going to start talking about the conservation zones, and there's two kind of levels of those. C1 is the more stringent conservation for higher priority features, and those are features like watercourses, wetlands, zones A and B of the Shamcook Lake drinking watershed, and the St. Croix corridor, so that 30-meter area. Those are very important for, especially the Shamcook watershed. That's very important for the drinking water supply of the town. And there is provincial regulation, and these mirror that. The C2 zone, that's less stringent. Still important to have conservation measures in those zones, but would not restrict development to the same degree. And again, they kind of go with the majority of it is really the zone C of the Shamcook Lake drinking watershed, and so land use is allowed, and that would be allowed. And within the urban service boundary, there's parks and open spaces that mostly are in the C2 zone, although there's the Pagan Point Nature Reserve, the Nature Conservancy on Navy Island. Those are higher priority as they're protected by other mechanisms. So these are pages out of the proposed zoning bylaw. This is what it actually looks like. That's kind of part of the update as well, is trying to create a document that visually is a little bit easier. The Town of St. Andrews zoning bylaw is at 22. It's 70 pages, mostly of text, and you need to interpret dimensional standards using text. And it's a lot easier to do some of that when you can actually see what a lot looks like, and that's what we've done here. So within the C1 zone, this is again that more stringent. It's subject to all the Clean Water Act regulations, so that's going to apply to the Shamcook Lake watershed, wetlands, watercourses, and water bodies. So it's allowing for conservation. But the one caveat to that is if there's a pre-existing use, some of the development in these areas happened before these regulations came into effect. You're still subject to those regulations, but from a zoning point of view, the use can continue and even expand. So it's a little bit different from just a grandfathered in use. And where you have that pre-existing use, there's the ability for these kind of very low intensity secondary uses like a short-term rental or a home-based business. There's also, if you look at the diagram, there's a requirement that most of the lot be set aside for the preservation, maintenance, and growth of trees. So that's part of the conservation standards. In the C2 zone, where it's a lower priority, that 75% is down to 25%. So again, there's still, the importance of we're going to try and have ecosystem regeneration or preservation on these areas, but there's much more ability for low intensity development like a camp, dwellings, like a house, that kind of thing, mini home, and that residential cluster development thing that I talked about, which can actually work really, really well if you're dealing with natural features. Basically, you say we're going to take that portion of the land, put it into a conservation easement, and then we're going to use the rest of our land more efficiently. That's what the residential cluster development allows. And there's those low intensity secondary uses in that zone, as well as institutional uses. So maybe a daycare, that kind of thing, potentially religious institution. Yeah. So we're, I guess, not moving in order of intensity. We're talking about the industrial zone, which is essentially the current Bayside Industrial Park, the land that's owned by the Regional Development Corporation on that side of the 127, and the freezer plant, and some of that. It's the old I'm not going to remember, something having to do. I think there's still some woodworking stuff that happens there. There's some transfer station kind of stuff happening. If you've driven past it, you know what I'm talking about. So the industrial zone is really for very intense uses, like your industrial uses. So if you think about the things that are happening in the industrial park now, all that stuff, resource excavation, that's your quarrying, and there's still those general standards that apply. As well, those types of activities go through licensing with the province. A lot of the standards in the zoning bylaw are mirroring the standards that the province applies in those cases. There is this is more and more becoming common that large employers in industrial areas, either there's a big project and they need to build a big new building in a relatively short amount of time, so they need to bring in a lot of workers, and that means they need some level of residential use. And currently the industrial zone doesn't allow for any residential uses. So there would be, if you have one of those main uses, this idea of having residences for workers. It's not specifically restricted to workers, but probably wouldn't be a great place to live otherwise. Okay, so moving into the more, I guess, some of the larger areas. This is that as kind of established rural residential. It's not exclusively residential, but predominantly residential. So it's the low intensity rural zone. And it actually looks very similar to the C2 zone. In terms of the main uses, where it is allowing for a little bit more intensity is you can have small main uses of agriculture, forestry, institutional, or small scale commercial uses. So, uh, and again, this is kind of trying to be in line with what's there currently, but with the understanding that you do have a lot of established residential uses in this area, and having large agriculture, forestry, or institutional uses or commercial uses would impact the character of those areas. It's a pretty standard rural lot size with those rural lot standards. So one dwelling unit per 4,000 square meters or acre. Those are the provincial minimum standards for subdivision. They're the general standards for subdivisions in the low intensity zone would mean that a certain lot could only be subdivided so many times. So the idea is more, maybe you're selling one or two lots. Maybe it's for family. This would not be a zone for large lots of dwelling subdivisions. There's other zones with better capacity for that, like the R2 zone, which has really good public road access. Generally, it's around the 127. So you've got those residential main uses, camp dwellings, the residential cluster development. You do have the potential for more intense agriculture, forestry, institutional uses, and large-scale commercial uses. So large-scale commercial uses are really auto-dependent commercial uses. They're things like gas stations, I think, would actually be a large-scale commercial use. If you had a big kind of recreation kind of area center, that kind of thing. You think of some of the if it has a large enough developed footprint, it becomes a large scale commercial use. So, if you think about St. Stephen, kind of the top of King Street, that area, your big grocery stores, hardware stores, that kind of larger retail. There is the opportunity for other commercial uses as well. You can do small and medium within the large scale. But there's municipal plan policies that really direct the smaller scale, pedestrian oriented stuff into the urban service boundary. All of the rural zones, as well as I think all the urban zones, allow for home-based businesses as a secondary use. Those are going to be more limited in what they can be. They really shouldn't be noticeable from outside of the lot, and there's limitations on number of employees. But there is more potential for commercial development in most of these zones as a main use, and you can have one or more main uses. So if you're going into these other categories, you're not going to be limited by that. That's going to be more applicable, I think, in the R1 zone, where the commercial uses are much more limited, or in the C2 zone. The last rural zone is the R3 zone. This is the rural resource zone, and it's much more, I guess I'd call it like the interior of the municipality, but outside of the Shamcook Lake drinking watershed. And this zone is really for those more intense resource development activities, like agriculture, forestry, resource excavation. You could have, utility uses, windmills, solar farms, things like that, those bigger utility uses. And it does allow for the pre-existing use. So again, if there's, you'll notice this doesn't allow for a main use of a dwelling. You do have to have one of those other uses. But it is certainly possible to develop a new dwelling on these lots as long as you have a main use. That's one of those categories. You'll notice one of them is conservation. So you could say, I'm going to conserve 75% of my land, and then you'd have 25% for a secondary use of a dwelling or a mini home. And it's interesting. We have zones like this in other parts of the region, and people think, oh, like I can't, develop here. I can't build a house. And we'll get calls from people who say, I want to do this thing, but I'm worried it's in the rural zone. And we'll say, well, are you going to do any agriculture, any forestry? Like, oh yeah, I want to homestead. I want to have my own animals. I want to cut my own firewood. Then that's great. That's what this zone is for. The other benefit of this zone, where it's further away from those established residential areas, it does require larger lots. The chances of those more intense land uses impacting your neighbors are very low. And this is an area where the province is very stringent. We do get questions like the 2 hectares, that's 5 acres. That's really limiting what I can do with my lot. And the province is aware of that, but they feel very strongly that you need to have areas of the municipality that can be developed for rural resources, and that's really a bare minimum. You look at other provinces and those minimum sizes are much bigger, 10 acres, even 20 acres in certain provinces where agriculture is very important. And as we saw from the public consultation, agriculture, food security, it is important in St. Andrews. And I will say from across the region, you actually have more agriculture happening in St. Andrews, especially Bayside, than lots of other places. So those are the rural zones. And now I'll talk about the urban zones. So the U1, it's kind of like the R1. It's for those more established residential areas. Doesn't mean they're purely residential. Like there's probably home-based businesses. But generally, there's a main residential use on these lots. So main use dwellings, basically, that's it. You can have secondary uses. And short-term rental would have to be a secondary use in this zone. That's something the municipal plan actually talks about, is in the low-intensity urban zones. Short-term rentals should be secondary uses. Where there's a little bit of flexibility, I've mentioned the home-based business. There's also the possibility of a very small institutional use. That's probably going to be like a daycare, a small daycare at that size. The lot standards, there's some parts of this zone which maybe only have access to municipal water or municipal sewer. So they might still need that 4,000 square meters. But within if there's services, the lot standards get smaller. And just like in the serviced residential zone now, there's the potential, depending on lot size, for up to 4 dwelling units. So this zone is I'll show it at the end, but I think it's quite similar to the serviced residential zone that exists currently. The U2 zone, this is, and I think one of the things I will say that council is definitely considering is within the town plat, how should the zoning work? Like, this is very much a draft proposal. This amount of U2, it could go down. Some of that could be replaced with U1. The idea is where you have those collector streets like Prince of Wales, parts of Water that aren't the historic business district, Parr and Montague. You do have a little bit more intensity of uses currently, and so maybe there could be a bit of that kind of typology across those streets. So what this zone allows for is up to 8 dwelling units, depending on the lot size. So you need 125 square meters per unit, and it caps at 8 no matter the lot size. But if you remember those general standards, once you get over a certain number of units, there's those requirements for more design focus. So that is one of the ways to deal with the potential for increased density here, which if we look at the public consultation, affordable housing, more housing options was very important. I know there's been some discussions around the age-friendly community, and the importance of having more housing options for seniors so they can downsize and still stay in St. Andrews. That came up as something that's really important. So that is why we think council should consider having this zone where it is in walkable areas. It does allow for other uses as well, like institutional uses. So, a lot of churches would be in this zone. And you could have a main use of a small scale commercial use. So those are fairly limited. There might be a little bit of extra traffic, but they're not going to be the types of things that you aren't already seeing in the plat. Like a little craft store, studio, antique store, small retail, that kind of thing. And the secondary uses, I think fairly standard. Again, short-term rental would be secondary in this zone. The U3 zone, so this is the highest intensity urban zone. And it's kind of the historic business district, and some of the commercial stuff up by the Algonquin, as well as the MBCC, and some of the kind of real apartment buildings, high density apartment buildings that have been developed in the last 10 or 15 years, and the large institutional uses like the Huntsman and the biological station. So this zone is I guess the most permissive zone in the urban service boundary. The number of dwellings is limited by the lot coverage. Institutional uses, so again, that's like MBCC, Huntsman. Those would be your kind of large institutional uses. Medium scale commercial uses, those are downtown focused, retail, restaurants, the kinds of things you would see on Water Street currently, as well as hotels. This is a zone where you could do short-term rentals as a main use as well as a secondary use. That's because you could have a hotel in this zone. So at that point, it's really one or the same. The lot standards are fairly permissive, except where you're abutting a U1 or a U2 zone. So where you're next to a lower intensity zone, there would be the requirement for larger yards, 10 meters for the rear yard and 7.5 for the side yard. So yeah, the medium scale commercial uses. It is important. One of the, I guess, conceptual changes here is rather than list a bunch of uses in this section of the bylaw, use definitions a little bit more strategically. So if you look at the medium scale commercial use definition, you will see this includes downtown oriented commercial uses such as but not limited to restaurants, retail, and tourism uses. So if there's whale watching, if there's like a bike rental place that opens up, your hotels, those kinds of things. St. Andrews is certainly a town that has a lot of tourism, and those are higher intensity uses where you have more potential for impact. So those are in this zone unless they're very small. This is a zone, the integrated development zone, that there's not really anything zoned for it currently. We've used it a few times in the current zoning bylaw where you have very strange developments that don't fit in anywhere. I think it would be less likely to be used in this new zoning bylaw where it's a little bit more modern and up to date, but it does create opportunities for very outside the box developments that are basically, you go to council and you make proposals and council gets to negotiate, and if you agree on what should happen, then it goes through a public process very similar to a rezoning. So there's that opportunity. It's a bylaw. Basically, a bylaw needs to be passed. Those are the main zones. I guess the integrated development zone would be considered a special zone. There's a few other special zones. We're getting close to the end of the presentation, and then we'll be able to open up the floor. So within the historic business district, council has been fairly clear that they want a lot of control. They have not been happy with the secondary municipal plan, and so they really want to put this stuff in the zoning bylaw, but still they want the control over it. So within this zone, which is basically the historic business district, any significant changes to buildings, the appearance of buildings, on the outside extensions, new main buildings, goes through a rezoning process with council. There's a few exceptions if it's getting if it's part of a heritage permitting process. So it's already going through stringent design review. There's requirements under the barrier-free regulation for accessibility, but kind of everything else is going to go to council. There's also the requirement, just like in the current zoning bylaw, to have commercial uses within the first 10 meters of the ground floor on Water Street to have a very engaging commercial streetscape. There's some design requirements. So even if you're not changing the shape of the building, where you're putting on new siding, there's material requirements, requirements for windows, things like that. A lot of this it exists, it's just in other places. What's really new is the level of council control over exterior changes to buildings, specifically getting bigger or new buildings. Another special zone, two special zones, natural hazard overlays. Just like the conservation zone, there's lower priority and higher priority. The higher priority is the ONH1, and that's basically the projected high tide line for 2100. So this is water on the property daily. And this limits development with some exceptions for accessory uses and small things, alterations that aren't increasing floor area. Again, there's carve-outs for accessibility. The ONH2 zone, which is for storm surges, it's more of a, this is, we know what storm surges are like today. When you get a big storm, there were some in I think it was 2024 winter, I remember. These are areas that they're not going to be inundated daily, but there needs to be some consideration for how buildings are designed. So these are areas where you have to build above a certain elevation, but there's more flexibility as to what you can build as long as you're above that elevation. So comparing the zones, the C1 zone is similar to the portions of the watershed zone, the Zone A and Zone B, the St. Croix corridor, and the environmentally significant area zone that did not allow for any development than Z22. The C2 zone, that's that lower priority conservation. That's kind of like the Zone C of the watershed zone in Bayside and Shamcook. Minister's Island, which is limited but allowed for some development. The green space zone in Z22, which is more of your parks and open space trails. Navy Island zone, which allowed for very limited residential development on Navy Island. The industrial zone is the industrial zone from Bayside, but as I mentioned, there's a lot of like light industrial, lobster holding facilities. Those were allowed maybe in the rural zone in Bayside and Shamcook, and those are where we saw land use conflicts. So those are clearly now being put into the industrial zone, which, as you saw from the maps, is fairly limited in where it's located. The R1 zone, that's that low intensity rural zone. Again, the rural zone, Bayside and Shamcook, allowed for so many uses that it's going to pop up again and again. So it allowed for those residential uses. It allowed for camps, that kind of stuff. As well, the estate residential zone, there were lots in the former municipal boundaries that had no services, and so they were acre lots, and they're quite similar. If there wasn't the sign coming in on the Bayside side, and you weren't from the area, you wouldn't know when you got to Jamie Steele's driveway that you were in the town of where there used to be the town of St. Andrews, and back at the Walker's driveway, you were in the former local service district of Shamcook. But that was the case. It is no longer the case. The R2 zone, that's that rural settlement. So maybe more subdivisions, more commercial uses. That's, again, all those were allowed in the rural zone. Commercial uses were allowed, tourism uses, all those types of things. And again, agriculture, forestry, even resource excavation was allowed to some extent in these rural zones in the Bayside and Shamcook plan. So those have been kind of separated out and put into their own zone specifically for rural resources. Now we're going to go kind of the other direction with the urban zones, the U1 zone, where you had these two zones, which basically allowed for the same land uses, but they had different lot standards based on one being serviced and one being unserviced. Those serviced residential and estate residential have become the U1 zone. The U2 zone, the mixed use zone. I mean, this is a mixed use zone as well. MR1, which was the apartment buildings within the town plat, and institutional uses, like I mentioned, your churches and things like that. So those had their own specific zone, although it didn't really deal with intensity. A small institutional use would be treated the same as a large one, like the Huntsman. So this is dealing more with the intensity of the use. And then in U3, you have kind of the most intense zones. Currently, Central Commercial, which is Water Street, Tourist Commercial, which is very specific, but allows some of the same things you could do in the Central Commercial zone. The MR2 zone, which is only for high density residential development, for your big apartment buildings, basically. Serviced residential cultural zone, which is just the Kingsbrae Kira, the amphitheater, which is really not a residential zone, even though technically right now it is. It's a main residential zone, but obviously amphitheaters, that kind of thing, is a fairly intense use. And the institutional zone, again, as I mentioned, you have some of those larger institutional uses like MBCC, and the research facilities. Those are fairly intense uses. So those are in the U3 zone. So as I mentioned before, it's really, we do this process to get your feedback, and it's really important for your specific property as well as generally if you see things that don't make sense to you. So I definitely encourage you to, if you don't already know what the proposed zoning of your property is, find out. If it's, you're having problems figuring it out yourself with the stuff that's online, give me a call. There's my information there, or send me an email. We can set up a meeting, or whatever. Maybe it's very simple. And if you do have specific property questions for me tonight based on this presentation, I'll do my best to answer them, but it's a little bit hard on the fly where I'm trying to look up things and find information. So if you have those kinds of questions, I'll do my best, but you're more than welcome to get in touch with me after this. No part of this that locks anything in has started yet, so we can make changes very simply. If you're more, you just have a comment, you don't like something, you think it's a bad idea, or you think it's a great idea, you don't normally hear support for these things, even when after they pass, people are like, oh, like this really helps me. And this is a good bylaw. It's council does benefit from hearing that early. So whatever your comment is, sending that to council is really important so they know it. We do see all of it, and we do address it, and we give recommendations to council based on that. We're in public information season right now, so we did one last Thursday, and we've got another one at the Bayside Community Hall coming up this Thursday. But you can always write to council, write to me, and I think that's the end of the presentation. I do see that somebody's popped something in the Q&A. I'll stop sharing my screen. And I'll just answer this. There's a question about different zones on the same lot. The zone applies where it is on the map. So lots can have multiple zones. And the zoning is really based on things like distance from roads, water courses. Once you get into the urban areas, it's a little bit more discrete and lot based. But in the rural areas, there's definitely some properties that will have multiple zones on them. So you can use the Q&A to ask questions, but I think another way to do it, or comments if you have comments. Again, I said this is being recorded, so and we do have a couple counselors and town staff here, so everybody's listening, and it will be passed on to the rest of council. But so you can either put things in the Q&A, or you can raise your hand, and then I can promote you to a speaker, and you can say what it is. Maybe it's just a comment, or if there's a question, I may be able to respond, or it may be something that I need to follow up on. And we've got about an hour, so we'll. I don't know. You don't have to speak. There's no requirement. But yeah, I will kind of stop talking now. And if you would like to speak, either ask a question or make a comment, you can raise your hand. You should be able to see the raise hand function at the bottom of your screen. There's kind of a panel with, what you see is a little different from what I see, but there should be a raise hand function. Okay, I see Lee's got their hand up, so I'm going to allow Lee to talk. So you should be able to speak now, Lee. You'll just have to unmute yourself. So I'm not able to hear anything. Um, okay, I'm not sure, Lee, what's going on with your audio. So I'll look at yeah, if you have, again, feel free to raise your hand, but I do have a few in the Q&A. So short-term rental is not the same as a long-term rental. And within the C2 zone, an accessory dwelling unit is an allowed secondary use. And that's kind of your long-term rental. That's generally referred to as an accessory dwelling unit. In zones where you can have more than one dwelling unit per acre, like your urban zones, then you could have more than one rental. But so short-term rental is different from long-term rental. But in the C2 zone, you could do either. Um, so and there's another question about multiple zones on the same property. So they're based on measured distances from features. So when you apply for a development permit or a building permit, um, we would look at the maps in the zone. If there's disagreements, then there may be questions. And I guess one thing for some of the natural feature boundaries, especially wetlands, we know that they can be incorrectly delineated. Those delineations are given to us by the province. And there's certainly cases where they're only using satellite imagery and elevation and they're off. So there is a clause in the zoning bylaw that says if there's an incorrect delineation and that gets redelineated, the zone boundary changes based on that natural feature. And this is having specific zoning around features, so having multiple zones on the same property, it's very common. It even exists within the town currently with some of the green space or ESA zoning. So it's something we do work with. It might look like it could get really complicated, but typically it's very easy to tell which zone you're in. But if you have specific questions about your property, feel free to follow up with me. So I'm not seeing anybody raising their hands, um, but I'm not gonna close anything just yet. And maybe there's another question. What is the time limit for discussions on this? It's really until council passes it. Once a date is set for a public hearing, then it gets a little bit more complicated to make changes before the final bylaw is passed. It doesn't mean they can't be. It just will extend the process, which is fine. And I guess just one thing I'll say that some people may or may not be aware of. There are municipal elections that will happen, I believe, in May. And there's a certain point before then where council kind of stops making major decisions. And so there is a point where, if this bylaw is not passed by then, probably sometime in April, it will have to be on hold until we have the next council comes in and can start looking at it. So right now, there's really no time limit. Once council starts the reading process and so council can make decisions until the day of the election on May 11th. Typically, they will be a little bit hesitant to do that, in my experience. Yeah. So I mean, if there's, I'd say if you have things that you would like to say now or say to council now, I would say them now. I wouldn't kind of wait, but there's certainly time to process and digest. We're going to have more public consultation this week. There will probably be some discussions with council on that after. And then depending on what we've heard so far, council will say, we want to start maybe we want to hear the views of the planning advisory committee. That's something that council would have to do with this bylaw, and then set a date for the public hearing, and then start the reading process. So the earliest this bylaw could be passed is it's probably sometime in March. But again, if it seems like, there's going to be major changes, this is important. Council said it's a priority, and they do want to try and get it done with this, I guess, mandate. That would be the word. Their mandate. But if it looks like they're going to have to make tons of changes at the last second, I don't think they would do that, and I think they would want to be as transparent as possible. I got a question. I see the comment from Lee, and I know council has seen those comments. And the comment from Brenda, if you want to have a rooster, it would depend on the zone. I'd say in most of the rural zones, you could. That would be considered a small livestock. It's just in the urban zones in the U1, U2. Currently, you can't have a rooster. That is typically one of the lines for having urban chickens anywhere is not having roosters. But if you're in a rural zone, I don't think you would need a variance to have a rooster. And I'm scanning for hands. Keeping an eye on the Q&A here. I know also it's can be intimidating to speak in public. So I really do encourage you, if you have questions or comments, please follow up. Again, I think if you have specific questions about zoning or how the plan would work, myself or Alex, who I mentioned earlier, we're the best people to answer those questions. But in terms of overall feedback, comments, we'll see them. But that's really important that council knows it. So I'll keep things open, maybe another just couple minutes here. I'll say if you're coming to the Bayside meeting on Thursday, it will be the same presentation, but there's always different questions and things like that. So happy to see you in person if you want to come out. Chris is saying put the web page link. It should be in the chat. And that is a great place to go. You can find the copy of the zoning bylaw there. And I'll answer Chris's question with that. You haven't met Chris McKinnon yet. He's the new clerk for the municipality. You may have seen him around. He goes by Mac because you've already got Chris Spear. Oh, that's not what I wanted to do. You've already got Chris Spear as the CAO. So I think I put that in. I don't know if I answered that correctly. If that worked, answered. Oh, it goes to the answered section. Yeah, so I put that there again. Oh yeah, it's a really nice table. I also did a more extended video going pretty in depth through every zone and talking in quite a bit of detail about the allowed uses. So I mentioned that thing about the definitions. I talk about pretty much all of the definitions that are implicated in the land uses. So that's it's about an hour of me talking about this stuff. So if you're looking for some sleep, we've also got comparisons of the old and new zones. That slide I showed. If you want to know more about the statements of public interest, that's there. The province put together a user guide, which gives information to people like me and to councils on what we should be thinking about in these plans. So sometimes I'll reference them, but if you want to know more detail, that's a great place to go. Yeah, this is a great online resource that Chris put together. So I definitely encourage you to take a look if you haven't already. Okay, I'm not seeing any more hands. We're at 7:15, not seeing any more Q&As coming in. So I'm going to assume that if you have something you want to say, you're going to reach out later. I'll just put my email in the chat and phone number, but should be able to find me pretty easily. And I thank you for coming out. Thank you for being engaged in your municipality. For some of you, it's a new thing to be in a municipality, and this is part of the reason why you get to be engaged in these things. You get to engage with your elected representatives, and it's a very important part of society and what we're trying to do. And so again, thank you for being engaged and being a part of it. And maybe I'll see you Thursday, or you'll see more of the bylaw as council discusses it more. So have a good rest of your evening, everybody.